let me know if you can't hear me.
I can turn it up.
Okay. Before I start, I want to get a feel for how familiar you already are with the United Nations Agenda 21 movement. So let me ask you to raise your hand if you have read or heard a presentation on Agenda 21. All right, let's go a little deeper here. Dan Peterson is with us tonight with the Coalition for Property Rights. Did I get that right? Coalition for Property Rights. And he has a great presentation that I've seen, and some of you may have seen. I'm curious, how many of you have seen the Coalition for Property Rights presentation? Okay, good. Wow, this is a very well-informed group. All right, one more. What about the John Birch Society video called What Agenda 21 Means to You? Oh, good. Good.
If you say anything about that, we don't know.
This is good. And I'm going to give Nance a chance to show off now. How many of you have read the book Behind the Green Mask? Okay, very good. Well, I may come back to the video. And Jack, I think I had it in that little container there. But, you know, there's a lot of really good material out there, books, videos, websites about Agenda 21. But I do want to warn you that, in my opinion, not all of it is equally helpful to those of us who ultimately want to win the war on this issue. And I call it a war because there's no question in my mind that what is happening is there is a war being waged against American ideals and constitutional concepts of self-determination, individualism, national sovereignty, free market capitalism, equal protection under the law, and private property ownership. And I'm going to make an assumption here that everyone in this room recognizes that these concepts are under attack right now, because you wouldn't be here tonight unless you were already engaged in this process. But the average person, including a lot of people that supported Barack Obama, have no idea that he's not a fan of these concepts, or that these concepts are under attack. They didn't make the connection when they listened to his rhetoric. And that's primarily because his rhetoric suggests that he's in favor of these concepts. He invoked the name of Ronald Reagan over and over again when he campaigned. He talks about entrepreneurship. You know, so he says things that make people think that, yeah, he's just an ordinary American. He's not out to, you know, do anything about these concepts that we hold dear. But you know what I found? I don't know if you listened to the Ohio State speech the other day that he gave, the commencement.
Oh.
Yeah,
About tyranny?
I think that he really is starting to show more of his colors there, because he talked a lot about how wonderful government is. And that if you hear people complaining about government, then they're just out to muck up the system. And he warned about those who say that tyranny is just lurking around the corner. And I thought that was very interesting that he seems to be starting to take this issue on, you know, just expressing it more. And it's kind of scary stuff. And then what's going on with the IRS and what's coming out. I mean, we know it's been going on for a long time. In fact, it's finally coming out. You know, it's sort of all coming full circle here. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the younger generation who has grown up under an entirely new paradigm that has woven concepts of environmental justice, social justice, sustainable development, and global responsibility into their curriculums at elementary school, middle school, high school, and college. Now, you know, wait a minute. I mean, these things sound kind of good, don't they? I mean, social justice. If I'm against social justice, then I must be for social injustice. What about sustainable development? If I'm not for sustainable development, I must be for unsustainable development. You know, so it's like if you talk about these things without really getting to the heart of what they mean, you basically look like you're a polluter, you're a bigot. You know, so these are really hard things to talk about when you're approaching young people, for one. You know, because they're growing up with these concepts of environmental justice, social justice, sustainability. College campuses, I think probably every college campus in America has a sustainability program. And so, you know, they're seeing these things as really good, wholesome things. You know, they're doing community gardens, they've got dormitories that are energy efficient, they have all these cool little recycling bins in the lobby of their dorms. You know, so, I mean, how could that be a bad thing? So it's John Burke's video, and I think what we'll do, since nobody's seen it, it's a really good tool. And I think that's going to be one of the most important things that we can do as we wage this war, is have access to the best tools that are out there. And the point that it makes is that we have but one planet, and we need to protect it. And the environmental movement did something really cool. I mean, it took secularists that believe in protecting Mother Earth and religious people who believe that we must be good stewards of God's earth, and brought us all together into this environmental movement. And it's been going on a long time. I mean, we've been recycling and, you know, doing things to protect the environment for a long time, and that's a good thing. But the John Birch Society makes the argument that environmentalism came to a fork in the road, and the rhetoric no longer matched the agenda. And that's really what Agenda 21 is all about. It takes this really cool rhetoric and these concepts that sound good, seem good, and then there's this whole underlying agenda there that, as you know, because you've heard about this before, you know, it's ultimately about control. You know, and as I read about Agenda 21 and I studied this, you know, it makes sense when you think about it. We like to feel in control. You know, we like to feel like we have control over things. I mean, a lot of times we recognize and we know that we don't, but we just deny that and we try to assume control over things. And, you know, think about the weather. The weather, I mean, for centuries, I mean, since the beginning of mankind, you know, we tried to tame the weather. You know, rain dances and sacrifices, you know, so that we would have enough water or there wouldn't be a drought. Or, you know, so when this whole thing about climate change and global warming came along, you know, what a great idea. We could do certain things. We could actually take control over the climate and the bad weather and the natural disasters. But if we don't do these things, then we're going to continue to have these, you know, horrific storms and, you know, the wildfires and all of these things. So what a brilliant but devious plan to use the climate and the atmosphere to say, let's all get together under this master plan of sustainable development. And we're going to be able to prevent this awful global warming and climate change thing from happening. We're going to be able to get control over it. You know, it was brilliant and it was devious at the same time. And another thing about it that makes it so devious and brilliant is they also tapped into our need as human beings to try to help people that are in need. I mean, how many of you at some point in your life saw an ad on TV and there was a starving child, and it moved you. I mean, and probably many of us in this room did send money, we sponsor children.
Never.
Well, under sustainable development, and UN Agenda 21, they take that concept of alleviating poverty and disease, and they grouped it in and said, this is how we do that. If we all live this way, we can eliminate poverty, we can eliminate disease. And so now you've got that group of people, which is a lot of us, that, sure, that's ultimately what we would like to see, a world that doesn't have poverty and disease. So they brought in that group. They brought in, they brought in the planners, the central planners, who have been around for, decades, if not longer. I mean, actually, you can go back, centuries. But we know that, like, even when our capital was designed and it was laid out, that was going on across the world, that you would lay out your plans and you would design your city and you would figure out where were you going to have your places of worship, where would you have your retail, where would people live. So planning like that has been going on for years and years and years. But under Agenda 21, they brought in the planners, to kind of help figure out how to do all this stuff. And they love that because, we all know, if you've ever spent any time with a land planner or any kind of plan, they love control. And the more you can take obstacles out of their way to controlling the situation, the better. I want to take you through a historical journey from the initial attempts at central planning in the United States to the present day. And we'll bring in the environmental movement, because obviously that's that glue that's holding all this together. And I also want to talk about NIMBYism. Everybody knows what a NIMBY is, right? It's that acronym for not in my backyard. And it's really interesting when you start delving into this. You find out that for NIMBYs, and a lot of times it's just people that are dealing with a particular situation that affects them directly. They don't want a, I'm going to still listen to them say, but they don't want a power plant. Remember that issue out in Toronto? Or they don't want a landfill near them, or they don't want a sand mine near them. And those types of activities most definitely have impacts on surrounding property owners. And so I kind of put those types of things in a different category of NIMBYism. And then you have this other category, well, I live on 5 acres of land and I want everyone else around me to do that. Or I live in this type of community and I want everyone else. So if it's not up to my standards, then I don't want it. So that whole NIMBYism thing has been going on since, basically since zoning came along in the U.S., and I'll talk about when that happened. But it's really interesting to see that a lot of times the NIMBYs have joined up with the Agenda 21 people because Agenda 21 people don't care about property rights. They don't like property rights. They don't care about liberty. But sometimes it's convenient for the NIMBYs to join up with them, and that has happened in Lake County on many occasions, and it will continue to happen, I'm sure. But let me ask you this before I move on. Do you want me to go through, I started with the 1920s, and then I come to the present, and I talk about things that happened in Lake County. Would you like to see the John Birch video, and then we do this, or should I keep going, and then we'll watch the John Birch? Keep going? Okay. All right. So in the 1920s, there was this movement in Europe that was called the Central Planning Movement. And there were folks in Europe that were coming over to the U.S. and they were trying to get this to get going in the United States. In 1926, there was a Supreme Court case, the Euclid case, and it's referred to now as Euclidean zoning, because the Supreme Court held that a local government could use zoning rules as a legitimate police power. And police power is basically that concept that local government can take actions that are for the health and welfare and safety of its residents and its population. And before that time, this had never been challenged, that you could actually say industrial goes here, residential goes there, and it was challenged, and the Supreme Court said, that's okay, that doesn't violate our Constitution because it's a legitimate police power for that local government to decide which land uses should be where. So then, that was 26. In 1928, in Chicago, there was this organization called the Central Planning Administration, and it's sometimes referred to as the 1313 Project. And it's kind of ironic, I guess, that it came out of Chicago, but that was a hotbed of intellectualism and architecture and so forth. And so they were promoting this regional planning concept. So they were off and running. The Supreme Court said we can do it, let's get a hold of these local governments, and they were using, this is really amazing, the Municipal League, the National Municipal League, which is like the current League of Cities, and the National Association of Counties, which Lake County is a part of that. All the counties are a part of the National Association of Counties. And they were going out and they were trying to get local governments to adopt these planning documents, and they were like writing them and showing them how to do it. The U.S. Department of Commerce comes along and they actually formulated a standard zoning enabling act for cities and counties. And so this was being circulated across America, these standard, rules, this is how you do it. And I'm not saying that's altogether bad, that we started having, some rules about where certain things should be and creating some, expectations about whether, you don't necessarily want a pig farm next to, your a residential area. And so, there's some, definitely valid police power issues there. Well, along comes World War II, and Hitler, which I describe as the ultimate tyrannical central planner, is eventually defeated. And, it's amazing. I was listening to a talk the other day at our Lake Federated Women's Club, and the writer lived in Germany during this time, and she talked about the fact that Germans didn't know about the devious side of what Hitler was doing. What was being presented to them was, I'm going to get you jobs. We're going to do something about unemployment. It was not, all of the devious stuff that was going on in other places, and it was all about, we're going to come back as, Germany, we're going to take care of ourselves, and I'm going to make conditions better, and it was all this lofty rhetoric, and everybody was falling for it. But, so when after World War II, we had this huge population explosion in the U.S. And so there was this group set up called the National Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs, and they were promoting this concept of administrative government, which was really bureaucratic government, not elected officials making decisions. And they had branches in every single state in our country. So this is going along, and here comes 1960. And if you think back, there's a lot going on, and you had, civil rights movement, and then you probably remember all of the. And I was a kid. I remember the gas lines, trying to go on vacation, and we were like, gas was being rationed out, and I even think my brother had a poster of President Nixon walking on a beach barefoot. And it said something about protecting the earth, and there was this whole movement. The Environmental Protection Agency was established, and there was this movement about the reliance on fossil fuels, and if you recall the condition though of a lot of lakes and rivers and bays in the U.S. We had pollution. We had it bad. So, the time was right to do something about that. And so, he led that charge, and a lot of good came out of the fact that up until that time, there had been very little done about the pollution. And it's amazing now, you go back to places that you might remember being polluted, and they're clean now. So, again, there were some good things that came out of that environmental movement that was swept across the U.S. But in '69, President Nixon divided the country into 10 federal regions and multi-county councils on government, and their purpose was to allocate federal funds and to promote uniform state and county laws. So this happened in 1969. Now go back to 1950, 2.7 million people living in the state of Florida. But by the 1970s, there were 6.8 million people in Florida. So this massive growth explosion was happening. And it was seen as a big economic force, no doubt, but it was a major challenge for the state of Florida. And the traditional zoning approach, what they call the Euclidean zoning approach, which was, R1, R2, commercial here, industrial there, this traditional approach had become very politicized. You would have large developers coming in and essentially getting whatever they wanted. I mean, there's no question that was going on. And the way that decisions were being made, if you were looking at whether there was any rationality, probably not. It was local officials deciding, hey, this is a great thing, let's go for it, this is what this developer wants, this will be good for the community, let's do it. But there wasn't any rhyme or reason to it. And so it set the perfect stage for kind of a backlash to that. And so in 1972, the Florida legislature adopted a state planning act. It was the first one. It's called the Florida Environmental Land and Water Management Act. And about that time, they started setting aside areas of Florida, and they were calling them areas of critical state concern. And they would essentially take these areas and they would put extremely onerous regulations on them, and basically say no development could occur there. But there wasn't a whole lot of buying up property rights. They were just saying, this is a critical area, this is how we're going to deal with it. So there were some pretty strict regulations that were going out. And we have one in Lake County, if you're familiar with the Green Swamp area of critical state concern. That was designated, but it was a little bit later. But you had the Florida Forever program came along, and they actually started buying up land. But when the state set this up, it was basically, they encouraged local governments to follow suit and come up with their own plans, their comprehensive plans. But they were aspirational. They didn't say you had to do it. So in 1975, the Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Regulation Act of 1975 was adopted, and regional planning councils were established, and they were there to review these things called developments of regional impact. And the areas of critical state concern were established. But this is really interesting. The appeal process for any of this went to the Florida Land and Water Adjudicatory Commission, and only the landowner, the developer, and the state planning agency had standing, and these were non-elected decision boards that made these decisions about how your land could or couldn't be used. So we're going along, 300,000 people a year coming into Florida, so we're still having this explosion of growth. So about this time, 1983, there was this thing at the UN called the Brundtland Commission. And they published a book called Our Common Future, and it was to preserve the planet for future generations, and they coined the phrase sustainable development. And their goal was to usher in sustainable development by 2000. So this is 1983. All right, so we had Florida put in 1975 its growth plan, but didn't have a whole lot of teeth. And then sustainable development was defined as sustainable development meets the needs of the present situation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So again, that sounds really good. Sounds like a good concept. In 1985, then the governor of Florida appointed the Environmental Land Management Study Committee 2, and they recommended a new comp plan in Florida. And at that time, they said all local governments in Florida must have a comp plan, a comprehensive plan by 1992, and these plans have to address everything from water, sewer, drainage, conservation and open space, recreation, and concurrency. which is, saying that you can't build more than you can,
Service.
right, you can service. This law was described across the country as revolutionary, that Florida had done this. And they put all of the control in this bureaucratic agency called the Department of Community Affairs. And every local government had to answer to the Department of Community Affairs. And you had to adopt your comp plan, send it up to DCA, that's what they call them, in Tallahassee, and they would decide whether your plan was consistent with the state plan. There was a state plan, and everybody had to be consistent with that. They had a tremendous amount of power. There was this huge power struggle that went on between those who believed it was a giant power grab from local governments and home rule, and it was just turned over to the state unelected officials. And all hell broke loose in Florida. So you had rural counties that said, we're not doing this, and then you had the more compliant counties that got it done. And the interesting thing is, about this time, 91, is when I moved back to Lake County and I started working for Cecilia Bonafe, who at the time would have been described as a preeminent land use attorney in Lake County, and all she handled were land-related cases. So at that time, they were negotiating with landowners who were being affected by this new comprehensive plan. And so I kind of got baptized by fire, and I was thrown right in there, with these big cases of mostly citrus owners and cattle farmers, people that had large land holdings, and they were very worried that their rights were being taken away, and once they were given a designation, they would never be able to do anything more with their land. It's really interesting. At the time, we were arguing over things like, do you get 4 units to the acre or 7 units to the acre? And in some cases, it was 1 unit to 5 acres. And that was really kind of the heart of it. And that was in 91. And when I talk in just a minute about what happened in 2005, 6, and now in Lake County, you're going to be amazed at how much changed, and it was because of sustainable development and Agenda 21. At that time, in 1990, there was this group called the ICLEI, the International Commission on Local Environmental Initiatives, and this was a great resource for environmental groups and NIMBYs to stop any kind of land development. And this was the organization that basically went into all the local communities and was doing the work of the United Nations in this really radical environmental movement. A lot of cities joined this organization, and there's just a lot it could be said. It's kind of scary stuff. That this was just a direct arm of the UN, but nobody knew that that's what was going on. Also, at that time, there was this new concept called Traditional Neighborhood Design Development, and they call it T&D. And it took place in Bedford, New Hampshire, and it was the first approach at designing a kind of from scratch a new town and a new town center. And this is where they would design, living above, retail below, and there were some really great places in the U.S. that implemented this traditional neighborhood design. And if you've ever gone to the areas, they're basically more affluent areas where, there's a lot of disposable income, a lot of people are shopping at the stores and so forth, and they can work. They can work in certain areas. But what they started doing is taking this concept and saying, oh, this is such a great concept, this needs to be done all over the U.S. We need to do this everywhere. So if you're going to build commercial down below, you need to build housing up above. And so they started pushing this across the U.S. There was also this thing called the Congress for New Urbanism. And they were promoting this idea of centralizing density into your urban areas and disallowing residential density in your rural areas. And that was their push. And there was also this thing called smart growth. And everybody started embracing smart growth. The Chamber of Commerce, they loved it. The business community loved it because it was kind of this way of saying, hey, we can have growth, but if we do it in a smart way, then we don't have to shut everything down. We're going to do it in a smart way. But it was this whole concept of put everything into urban centers. This was not happening by accident. these things were happening. They were a direct result of what happened in 1983 with that Brundtland Commission in that book that came out, Our Common Future. And the charge was to go out and get this information out all across the U.S. and all across the world. And at the same time, you had all of this stuff going on with social justice and environmental justice and social equity and collective responsibility. And so there was this whole like legal movement about environmental justice. And these concepts started getting a foothold in mainstream discussion and so forth. I was thinking about the social equity and environmental equity and all of that. And, when we were growing up, I don't know, I'm sure everybody's heard this before. You didn't like the way something turned out when your parents said, life isn't fair. And that's just how it is. Life isn't fair. Well, you look at these concepts of social justice and social equity and all this stuff. I mean, that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, we can make it fair. Right. We can fix that. And a lot of people gravitate towards that. They think that actually is doable. That you can fix everything, and you can make it all fair. And this all was going on. I was thinking about President Obama when he was running, and he said he wasn't promoting class warfare.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he didn't have to. This was all going on behind the scenes. And this whole idea that some people have too much. We need to take that from some people and give it to people that don't have enough, and all of that had been churning in America, for 20, 30 years leading up to him hitting the scene. And, I think that the idea of capitalism being, essentially stigmatized as greed. I mean, you see that in movies. They're teaching it on college campuses. Then, in his election, all of a sudden we saw this 1% thing pop up. Oh, yeah, that just happened. That was grassroots, I mean, they knew that all this was churning below the surface, and what a perfect opportunity to say, we got to do something about the 1%. They've got everything. We got to take from them. This isn't fair. But anyway, just this little side note there, that this is all going hand in hand with this idea that we have to make things just, we have to make them fair, we have to fix everything. We can do this by creating all this order. We all have the same rules, we live under these same principles, and we don't just do this in the U.S., we do this across the world. And the UN is sending people out all over to the undeveloped areas, and they're doing this thing called sustainable rural development and rural settlements, and they're teaching people how to set up their own little sustainable communities. Well, 1992, so 91 we get our first comp plan in Lake County. 92 the Rio Earth Summit happens, and this was the dream come true for everybody that wanted to pull all this together, because at the Rio Earth Summit they had the adoption of the Global Climate Change Treaty. And a lot of people don't realize we actually signed a treaty about climate change, and we did that at that time. It didn't have a whole lot of teeth, but it said we're going to do these things in the future, but we all were buying in, according to the treaty, to the idea that yes, the climate was changing and it was man-made. And that laid the groundwork for everything that happened after that point. And it brought together this concept of we are all interconnected, it's one planet, it's one atmosphere. What we do here affects somebody there, and therefore we ought to be able to dictate how everybody lives across the globe, because we're all impacted by each other's actions. And one of the guys that was there speaking, he talked, and I think he was actually in charge of the entire event there at the Rio Earth Summit. I think he was presiding over it, and he said that we're living in a way in the U.S. or across the world that's unsustainable. We've got to reduce raw meat consumption. We have to do away with mortgaged homes in the suburbs. We've got to get rid of cars and reliance on fossil fuels. We've got to centralize density into urban hubs. that was what this was all about. You know, they don't like the way that we do things, especially here in America, and we're going to change that. And the climate change is what is the catalyst that makes it so urgent that we get this done. So 1993, after that happens, President Clinton is elected. He signs an executive order, and at that point, sustainable development and Agenda 21 goes into every aspect of the federal government. HUD, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the USDA, EPA, Department of Education. And part of that is they say we've got to get into the schools and we've got to teach sustainable development. We need to get to our young people early so they understand all this. So, I mean, in 93 it starts being filtered into everything. Concepts like new urbanism, traditional neighborhood design, smart growth, they're in vogue. Everybody's embracing them. They think it's great, you know, but in reality, imposing this in certain areas, it doesn't work. These developments start failing in a lot of places because it just doesn't work. And the key behind a lot of this was sprawl was bad. Now, this is an interesting issue, and it's a hard issue. Because, part of this started with Prince Charles in England, and he's a big proponent of all this stuff. But he was concerned that there were housing developments popping up across their countryside, and it was their countryside and their rural areas that made England, Scotland, so special. And so he felt like something had to be done about that sprawl. And then that started taking, same thing in America. And in Lake County, same issue. You're driving down your country road and you're thinking, wow, this is so beautiful, this is Lake County, we need to preserve this forever. But it's not your property, it's somebody else's. And so you have this big collision between what do we really believe in the way of property rights and what people should be allowed to do with their land versus what do we want electively, or what do we want personally to see happen on somebody else's land. And it's a big conflict, and it happens, it is still a glaring conflict. My answer would be that we look at buying the development rights, so that, say, a farmer is going to be left with only farming his land the rest of his life, then purchase his right to develop from him. That seems to be a way to reconcile the fact that you decided that he should farm forever, and yet he may one day want to sell his farm, or mortgage, or use it seasonally. Get loans in order to pay for his needs until he gets his crops and so forth. But what was going on in Lake County? In 1988, there was a commissioner named Richard Swartz who was elected, and Richard soon became known as King Richard. How many of you remember Richard Swartz? Okay, yes, there's some remember. He voted no on everything. There was always a 4-1 vote, and he always voted no, no matter what. I just really can't remember, especially on land use issues. He would never approve any development, always voted no. And what's interesting is that in 1992, Jimmy Connor actually ran against Richard Swartz, and Jimmy ran as a pro-growth, pro-property rights candidate, and he lost. Swartz won. And let's see, then we had Bill Good come along, who was a staunch environmentalist, and he was, I think, the only Democrat ever elected to the county commission, and he was outwardly vocal about this. He was anti-development, anti-growth, period, and he won. And then another kind of activist came along. She wouldn't mind me saying this, I don't think, but she had gotten involved in Leesburg fighting the orange juice plant, which is now Petrali. She didn't like the way it smelled, and she was trying to get it shut down. And then she springboarded from there to the county commission, and she was on the county commission, so we had this like anti-growth kind of pendulum swing in Lake County. Then Schwartz leaves, Debbie Stuyvesant takes his place, Catherine Hansen is elected, first female county commissioner in Lake County in 1990. let's see, the building boom begins. So, I don't know, what, 2001, 2, it started really picking up, and it started getting really crazy. Bob Poole from Claremont was on the county commission at that time, and he was clearly viewed as pro-growth. At that time, we also had this thing called the plaque. Ken LaRose, who started the first Green Day, he went out and he sold this concept in the business community that we should vote as residents of Lake County to increase our taxes in order to buy land that was under the threat of development, so that we could set aside some land in Lake County. And you guys know how the margin that passed? 70% of Lake County residents voted in favor to increase our millage in order to buy land. But what happened after that is they set this committee up, and they went out and they bought land in Lake County, and they bought land that was not under the threat of development. Yes, it was environmentally sensitive land, but it was not under the threat of development. They didn't set aside enough money to take care of the land, to manage the land. And, you know, when you own land like that, big areas of land, I mean, fire protection is one of the biggest issues, and you've got to do certain things in order to make sure that you're not creating a hazard for the rest of the area. So that's expensive. So we have all of this land that wasn't under the threat of development in most cases. Then we had this group pop up called the Citizens Coalition of Lake County, and there was a guy by the name of Rob Kelly in South Lake County that ran this thing, and it was hardcore anti-development. We had a website. It was anti-property rights, big time. Lauren Ritchie was on the scene the whole time, writing stories about how bad development is and how bad growth is, and she studies with these people. And then in 2006, Linda Stewart runs for District 4, which is the district I'm in, and she beats Catherine Hansen, who's been there for 16 years, and she beats her on a platform of enough is enough. And I mean, Linda clearly runs on an anti-growth platform. Elaine Rennick does the same thing in South Lake County, and she defeats Bob Poole. They make appointments to this group called the Land Planning Agency. And the Land Planning Agency was charged with rewriting the Lake County Comprehensive Plan and bringing it up to the standard that it needs to be at according to state law. So we get these appointments on our Land Planning Agency. We get a guy by the name of Keith Shue, who works for the Nature Conservancy. He takes over that whole committee. Rob Kelly, the guy at the Citizens Coalition, he's there. And they're going to town on this thing. And if you see how many people sat on this committee that lasted for maybe a year and then they couldn't take it anymore and then they left, because it was outrageous. They were putting these land uses on people's land, and you would ask the question, well, what are you going to do about, this person thinks right now that they've got a commercial piece of property. Too bad, too bad. It's a legitimate purpose. And Weldon Cabell was the county commissioner at the time, they're just, I guess it was just the political winds at the time that nobody stood up and said, this is a problem. Jennifer Hill was the lone commissioner. It turned at that point. She became the 4-1 commissioner. She was the one that would vote against some of this stuff and said, this is taking it way too far. It's amazing some of the stuff that they put into effect. They said that you could only have a certain square footage of your yard could be ground cover. You couldn't have certain types of grasses. There were just regulation after regulation that no concern over what it costs the homeowner, how it affected the economy. And I would go to these meetings and I think, what about property rights? I can't believe this is happening. Somebody needs to stand up and do something. The economy goes in the tank. Obama comes along 2008. He pushes sustainability to a whole new level, way beyond where Clinton ever took it. 2010, Rennick is defeated by Commissioner Parks, and I ran against Linda Stewart, and we had some really heated debates and forums over property issues and so forth. Here we are in 2012, and sustainability is everywhere. Obama has practically nationalized the car industry. You know, we had the cylinder debacle, where they tried to use sustainability in the Rio Summit and climate change and all of that to basically pick winners and losers and impose things, you know, technologies that weren't there yet, that weren't necessarily ready, to make bailout. And we had the whole, you know, the housing collapse. And it's really, sometimes I wonder whether that was really all part of somebody's master plan, that we would have that housing collapse so that, you know, people, number one, they would lose their homes, this idea of having a mortgaged home and living in the suburb, or, you know, living where you want to live, you know, starts being threatened, and, you know, it values, our values go down the tube and all that. So I do want to point something out, that I have seen proposed resolutions that some local governments have considered adopting that basically say, we as a local government, we are against Agenda 21, and we won't take any money from the federal government that has anything to do with Agenda 21, and you know, they're taking a stand. Well, the problem there is that all of these federal agencies are all of their rhetoric is all intertwined with this Agenda 21 stuff. So the way that our funding works, you know, this gigantic federal government we have, the way that it's set up, is that that's how local governments get their money. I mean, you apply for these grants. These aren't grants like not-for-profit organizations applying for a grant that they hope they get. I mean, this is what local governments do. They put their applications in to try to get some of their money back. So if you say we're not going to take anything from the federal government that's intertwined with Agenda 21 and just that broad thing, you're not going to have any money locally. And what would happen then? Your property taxes would go up. Our property, you know, our values actually would go down. I mean, our community, I mean, it would be very difficult in a community that did that. And maybe I'm getting a little bit too cynical here, but I almost think that what they want rural America to do is to do that. To say, we won't take any of the federal government money. And then we all start falling apart and collapsing, and there, boom, they got it. And then we all have to live in the cities. We all have to live in these little urban areas. You know, because that's ultimately what they want. They want us out of the countryside. And they don't like our way of life. They don't like the fact that we want to control our destiny. We want to have certain liberties and freedoms because, you know, that, then they can't control us. So it's just a thought, and maybe it's not true, maybe it's not part of the master plan of somebody's, but I have to wonder the way that they have so meticulously planned all of this stuff out. I want to talk just a little bit about, I call them red herrings. There are terms, there's terminology out there that people say, oh, that's sustainable development, that's, you know, you have to be careful that you don't overreact, I think, to some of this stuff. I'm going to use bike paths as an example. I had somebody come up to me not long ago that was very in tune with Agenda 21, and they basically were saying that bike paths were part of this international conspiracy to get us out of our cars and take away our cars. And, okay, I mean, really? And if you go and you try to tell that to somebody else, do you think they're going to think that we're maybe crazy? I mean, I think you got to be careful about, maybe, yeah, in somebody's mind that's what, you know, ultimately they would like us, you know, not to have cars, but is it going to be because we built bike paths? Because bike paths are actually one of those things that, like, homeowners that are looking in a community love them. You know, it's a real asset, you know, and it actually helps the local economy if that's a part of, like, their park network or their amenities. Yeah, you can take it too far. I mean, you can definitely take it too far. I mean, they do things like put these bike trails on the sides of roads in places that there is no way anyone in their right mind would ever be on a bicycle there. And that's kind of silly. You know, but when it comes to Lake County looking at trying to have some trail connections and all, I would just caution that's I don't think I would scream and holler about that type of thing. Walkability. You know, they say, oh, we want to make things walkable. Therefore, when they take our cars away, we'll be able to get our cars away, they really care whether we can get from point A to point B. Let me give you an example of walkability. Yeah, you can take any of these things to an extreme and they can be ridiculous. I believe that. And you can waste money on things you shouldn't waste money on. But 441 used to not have crosswalks anywhere. And you took your life in your hands. In fact, I think it was against the law to actually cross the street. And so over on Donnelly and Mount Dora, when they put the Publix on the other side of the road, on the north side of the road, you had people that needed to get to that Publix and know they couldn't. So they put crosswalks there. And they've done that along 441. I actually think it's a good thing. You know, my son used to want to ride his bicycle from Eustis over to downtown Mount Dora and ride around the spread, but we couldn't let him do that because there was no delineated place to go across the highway. So that is one of those walkability things. So not all things that are designed to make the community walkable are bad things. There was another one. Traffic calming. Yeah, traffic calming. There are times when they use that to try to redirect traffic, and sometimes it's really inconvenient, it's a bad location, and you know, they're trying to change people's behavior patterns and stuff, and it's you know, it can get out of control. But there are also times when it's a good thing, where you slow people down. And somebody, and they might be in this room, but they've told me before that they really hate the fact that when they go down Main Street in Campione,
yes,
it takes so long. Like, this isn't supposed to take long. If you're on your way somewhere, you need to be on another road. If you're in downtown Campione, you're going to some place in downtown Campione, and you're just going to take a little bit longer, and we don't want you to run over somebody. You know, so that's, you know, putting a lot of stop signs in a downtown district is one of those traffic calming things. Now, there are people that say, oh, that's Agenda 21. Well, again, you gotta be careful that you don't overdo it. And I do want to talk about one thing that was very controversial, because they covered it in the newspaper, and there was a lot of, you know, stuff said about it. That I want to set the record straight, because I think that the facts. I feel very good about the facts and the way that I voted on an issue, and that is the roundabout at 455 and 561. That will be several years down the road, I'm sure, before it actually happens. But what that was all about is we pay federal gas taxes. We pay them to the federal government, they collect them, and we only get them back when we ask for them back. And they tell us which programs we can use to ask for them back. So we don't really have a choice of saying, oh, we really have these things over here that we need. Can we please use this program to fund that? It doesn't work that way with the federal government. I mean, you either fit into that program or you can't get that money. So we knew we had a problem at 561 and 455. We have a very dangerous intersection there. We put flashing lights up. And we had an option. We could either build an intersection ourselves that would be a traditional, you know, T intersection that would probably start with a flashing light and ultimately have a traffic signal. We had to do that out of county money. Couldn't use gas tax money from the federal government for that. Or we could agree to build a roundabout there, very wide, 180 feet from one end to the other. So it's built so that trucks can work around. It's very different than this little one here, very different than the one that's at Sugarloaf Mountain that's really way too little to work. And so it's very large, and only one car is in there, you know, at a time, and it keeps the traffic moving. We knew that Mineola Interchange was slated this legislative session to get the money necessary to begin that project. And it is likely that next year you will start to see dirt being moved and that interchange being built in Mineola, which is only about 3 miles from where this intersection is. We have this bad intersection. We know we're going to get an influx of traffic out there because there are over 6,000 homes on the books right around that Mineola interchange. There is over 1 million square feet of industrial space. 300 hotel rooms. These are all on the books. They're, quote, entitled. So all that has to happen is they come in and they get their permit. So you're going to see this massive growth occur if the economy, when it comes back, as that interchange gets built, the potential is huge, and there will be a lot of traffic on that particular area because that's how you'll go to and from that interchange. So that, I supported it. There were 4 of us that supported it. Jimmy didn't support it. You know, and he said, oh, you're taking borrowed money. Well, there's a lot of borrowed money coming out of Washington, but gas taxes is not one of them. Okay, gas taxes, they actually, it's an enterprise fund. They only fund in their budget every year what they bring in, and then they divvy it back out to local governments. So that was the thought process. I was trying to look down the road, trying to be proactive, and trying to prevent a situation where we would have to come out of our own property tax money, our general fund, to pay for a transportation improvement that we could actually qualify for if we did it as a roundabout. You know, so, and the traffic experts all said, I know there are people that have been, you know, different places, they don't like roundabouts, this or that. A lot of them are actually traffic circles, which are very different than roundabouts. But the engineers say this is much safer because you're not coming to that intersection going 45 miles an hour, and if you miss that light, you don't see it, you run it, and you've got a fatal collision. In a roundabout, if you have anything, you have cars bumping each other, but you're not going to have a fatal collision. So that was the thought process on my end behind that. So with that being said, if y'all want to, if everybody has enough patience at this point to watch it, it's really a fascinating video.
How long is it?
Do you have to look at this?
So actually, your vote for the roundabout is because you're against Agenda 21, because you want to promote development there and promote property rights.
Well, I think that...
I'm just trying to put the right spin on it.
Well, no,
I've been watching Obama all day. So.
Well, actually, that Mineola interchange could be a really great economic generator for this county. Because
I'm just being...
Yeah, no, but seriously, I mean, that has the potential of being a huge thing for Lake County. That could be kind of like our Lake Mary area. You'll probably see some traditional neighborhood design out there, you know, because it may work there. It may actually work there. But it's so close to Orlando. When you get on the turnpike at that point, you are very close to, you know, all of the things in Orlando. So.
Who brought the popcorn?
It says play.
Click on play and then hit the one line down.
It's a letter like this. It starts with a letter like this. P.
You have up at the top, play. Okay. Now hit play pause.
Right.
And then you go down here.
That's not it, guys.
How about the blue arrow on the bottom?
See, this guy didn't light up. There it is, right there.
You see the bottom, the arrow at the bottom that says play? Yeah, it's right down at the very bottom in the center.
Oh,
Keep
yeah.
on going, there we go. Wait, cut!
That's it?
Try it. Change color.
It didn't recognize it. What, it's showing your videos. Where's the CD?
Oh, that's not the video I want to see.
I'm gonna let it load again. You've got the media player and you're looking at your live.
While they're playing with that, can I ask you a non-Agenda 21 DOT question? Yesterday,
Windows Explorer. Here we go.
I'll say later.
I had to reload it, sorry.
I never told you all the stuff.
Let me, we want volume, right?
And closed captioning. Popcorn.